this next panel, the next panel, you're free. They're gonna give a little opening synopsis of their thinking, but they're gonna be free to comment on anything that went on today, or anything that hasn't gone on, anything you think happened in the election that is interesting, affects Canada's future or the U.S. politics, whatever it might be. But what we have here are actually Larry Herman and Selma Lessenberg are been active in the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. David Jacobson has come to a lot of our programs. He's been a leader here at the Canada Institute. So they're going to take a look at some of the private sector issues, the business consequences, and others. But I want them to feel free to talk about anything, whether it's Canadian unity, Arctic issues, whatever, the impact of Barack Obama. But let me just start with Selma Lessenberg is a retired senior executive. She currently serves as a corporate director. She had 25 years as a senior executive in business and governance, as general counsel and corporate secretary. She worked, like, for example, in the telecom industry, also for the Greater Toronto Airports Authority. She's really been active in so many things in Canada and been an active member. There's Paul Hill here, too, from Saskatchewan, my old friend.
I didn't need an introduction.
Yeah, but you're a supporter of this institute, so we do like that. And you're going to be supporting the Canada-U.S. Law Institute in the future, I might add.
He sure is.
Hear, hear.
Anyway, but Selma has been a real superstar with our Canada-U.S. Law Institute. She's from Toronto, and we appreciate that. Larry Herman, you have the bios of these people, but he's a lawyer. He's a national trade lawyer. He's been dealing with trade issues both inside and outside the government for over 45 years. He's been involved with the UN, with GATT, a lot of different things, NAFTA panels. He's with Cassidy Levy Kent, Ottawa and Washington, an outstanding international investment law firm. And he has been a real leader in the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. And when I got involved with the Institute, you were already one of their mainstays, along with Henry King and the others. So that's a wonderful thing. And then there's David Jacobson. You heard me talk about David earlier. He's been active in Chicago and Illinois and U.S. politics. There's an old joke about how he became ambassador. He was put in charge by Barack Obama in selecting ambassadors.
Called my own number.
And they
Work.
And he picked all these people to go to France and Switzerland and Japan and China and all these places. But somehow there was a vacancy in Canada. And he looked around and went, "My God, it's me." So he pulled a Dick Cheney. However, unlike Cheney, he didn't start any wars. He served with great distinction. He's now vice chair of a BMO Financial Group, but he's been involved in so many different things. He's involved with our National Archives. He's actually spearheaded a program tonight at the National Archives on women in politics. It's a bipartisan forum of women leaders that's being held tonight. So he's a leader in every respect and a dear friend of Canada and a dear friend of mine. So I'm happy to have him as part of this panel. I'm going to stop and let the panelists speak for themselves. And so why don't we start with Selma? Give us your take and move it on to David and Larry, and then we'll have a dialogue.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. Far too flattering, if you ask me. I also wanted to take the opportunity to thank the prior panel. I thought they were extraordinary, and I also very much enjoyed Nick's presentation. A great way to paint a picture of what Canada is looking like. And that sort of leads into my remarks or my thoughts with respect to what is the business impact of this election. And I think from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges for business is uncertainty. You like to know the environment within which you're operating. I think currently our major businesses and organizations don't quite know what the outcome is going to be. We've heard that the Prime Minister is not going to make alliances. So it's going to be an issue by issue parliament. What does that mean for business? Business is going to have to invest far more heavily than it has in the past in terms of building relationships in Ottawa. Also, they're going to have to invest even more heavily in building relationships within the, I'll say, the provincial leaderships, because we have this incredible schism in Canada now where we have Saskatchewan and Alberta, very much isolated on the federal level. Interesting that Jason Kenney announced, I think it was this morning or yesterday, that he's going to raise the carbon tax from $20 a ton to $30 a ton. Why is he doing that? Because he does not want the feds to impose anything on him, and he thinks that he can sell that within the Alberta population, and that Albertans prefer to be ruled by their provincial government than by their federal government. That's further sort of paints the tone of alienation that we're seeing. We also saw a widening gap between urban and rural. When you look at what the election brought, the Liberals and the NDP tend to win in the more urban centres. So we have that divide that we've seen in the UK with Brexit. I don't think anybody in Canada is hoping for a Brexit kind of situation, but there's obviously talk about, Western separation. We saw a campaign which was low on talking about economic realities, about foreign policy, about international trade and investment. Those are areas of great concern to anyone who wants to grow their business. We need to diversify our exports. We need to do more investment. We used to be hewers, hewers of water, hewers of wood, drawers of water. We have moved away from that, other than our natural resource sector, which is generally speaking lagging. So we need to invest in other parts of the economy, and we haven't seen any of that, which goes back to really my principal point about the uncertainty. Just one last comment. We've seen the dichotomy between climate change and energy. I would say on the upside for that, there is tremendous opportunity for those who want to invest in new energy, clean energy opportunities. And if I was doing a strategic plan for a company, that would be very high on my list of what does climate change mean to my supply chain, but also what does it mean? What are we going to see in the way of a legislative framework in Canada, and where can I bring in new and innovative products in order to enhance my bottom line? And as I said, we've got this terrible dichotomy between the pipeline, which is, on the one hand, not seen as green, and yet we have, I think the one issue that came out throughout the whole campaign was climate change. Everyone was talking about it. So I'll leave it at that and pass the torch to David.
Thanks. First of all, I want to say how, and this is the truth, how delighted I am to be here for at least a few reasons. One is that it's this combination of CUSLI and the Wilson Center, both of which I have been involved in, and I think it's great that they're doing things together. And for those of you who are looking for some place to go in the spring, go to Cleveland for the CUSLI meeting. The other reason is, as I look around the room, there are so many people here that I know from my days in Canada, some of whom I've not seen in quite some time, and it's great to see all of you. Talking about, what's the impact on the relationship of this election, I was reminded of something that Lord Palmerston said, and I've become very interested in Lord Palmerston since I watched the Crown television program. This is where I get all my information. And he said that nations have no permanent friends or allies; they only have permanent interests, and a lot of people have said that since. But I think that's very true about what's going on here, that the United States and Canada are bound together by a whole host of permanent interests. They're bound together by their respect for the rule of law. We're here with the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. I don't think there's a, Canada-China Law Institute or a U.S.-China Law Institute. They're bound together by geography. It's the longest border between two countries of anywhere in the world. Our democratic values, the integration of our economies and supply chains, the fondness that people in Canada have for Americans and vice versa. And those permanent interests are going to survive the election you just had in Canada, and they are going to survive. They survived the last election we had in the United States, and they'll survive the next one. The other thing that I want to mention, and my guess is we'll get more into this as we go forward, is the prospects of the USMCA. We've heard about what people think about the prospects in Canada, and it seems fairly certain. Everyone says if it's passed in the United States. This is my fourth trip to Washington this month. I'm a glutton for punishment. I only come here when I need my blood pressure elevated a little bit. But in those 4 trips, I have talked about this subject, the prospect of the USMCA, with members of Congress from both parties, from people in the administration, including some senior people in the administration. I've talked to commentators, I've talked to lobbyists, I've talked to taxi drivers. It's just totally all over the lot. If you talk to some people, they will tell you that it's for sure going to pass, that the Democrats want to get it passed, that Nancy Pelosi is looking for a path forward. If you talk to others, they'll tell you that it is impossible, that because of our political division, particularly, and this is really a Democratic issue, that the Democrats don't want to give a win to the president under any circumstances. There is a lot of talk about the impact that the impeachment inquiry has on it, and some people will tell you that it has just absolutely killed it dead, and other people will tell you that because of the impeachment inquiry, that it makes it more likely that it's going to be approved because the Democrats have to show that they can both investigate and legislate, and this is one of the very few things where there is any possibility of getting something done. I will tell you that, if I were honest, I'd probably say I don't know what's going to happen, and it really is balanced on a razor's edge. Instinctively, my own view is it is probably not going to be approved this year, although that's really just for the first point I made, that Democrats don't want to give the president a win, for better or for worse. It's just the reality. But I will say this, that while it may not pass this year, and if it doesn't pass this year, it probably won't pass in 2020 because we'll be in an election year. But one way or another, either the USMCA or something very much like the USMCA is going to pass. And the reason it's going to pass is what I started out with, which is the interests that bind us together. And one of the interests that binds us together is our economic interdependency. And so I don't see this as going away anytime soon. Larry?
Well, David, I thought those were very perceptive comments. I want to talk mostly about not the future of Canada, but the future of the relationship. And both Selma and David have set the agenda very, very well. And the last panel, I thought, were very very good about addressing the relationship.
Is your microphone working?
I don't know.
Is it working?
Pull it close.
Yeah. David, the point you just made is very very appropriate. Look, if we didn't have the USMCA, and if we didn't have the NAFTA, Canada and the U.S. would still do business together. Business will be done. The absence of a trade agreement would be problematic. It would create uncertainty, but Canada and the United States will continue to exchange goods and services forever because the relationship is that close. If the USMCA were not approved, then we would have the NAFTA. And the question then becomes whether the NAFTA would remain in force. The president campaigned against the NAFTA in the election, and so a lot of questions will arise if the USMCA hits a dead end in the Congress. And that uncertainty from a business perspective is quite worrying. But as I said, as worrying as that might be, Canada and the United States will inevitably continue to do business together. It will have a lot of uncertainties, but business will be done. I just want to just change course a little bit and talk about the asymmetrical relationship. We know in Canada that the United States has a global agenda. They are dealing with global issues. Canada is often forgotten in the scheme of things, but the U.S. is the primary world power economically and militarily. and I dare say politically, and always will be, as we see it in Canada. So Canada comes on the radar screen from time to time. It was certainly on the radar screen during the USMCA negotiations, but there are those major asymmetries in the relationship. So here are a couple of points to watch for in the near future. First of all, who will be the new Canadian ambassador to Washington? Some discussion in the previous panel on this point. My view is it will be somebody at the political level. We've gone beyond the days where we appoint senior diplomatists or public servants to head our post here in Washington, and in the same with the U.S. ambassador to Canada. The point about the Canadian nominee is that that person, he or she, has to be seen by the people he or she are dealing with in Washington as having the ear of the Prime Minister. Not only the ear of the Prime Minister, but being able to make a telephone call directly to the Prime Minister. That is critical, and in my view, that means that the next Canadian ambassador will be somebody from the political class, if I can put it that way. Watch for it. It will have a major bearing on the course of the relationship as to who that person is. The other issue, not often discussed, is who will be responsible in the new cabinet, which, by the way, I think our American friends understand that Trudeau has been reelected, but his cabinet will not be sworn in for another 3 weeks, the 20th of November. And so the choice of cabinet ministers, particularly those ministers directly responsible for the U.S. relationship, is vital. Who will be the foreign minister and who will be the trade minister? Very unusually, in fact, it was unprecedented that the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs was handling the USMCA negotiations. That has never been done before. It has in prior negotiations with the U.S., the Free Trade Agreement in the 1980s, the NAFTA some years later, was always fronted by the trade minister. In this particular case, Chrystia Freeland, as foreign minister, was the trade negotiator. That has never happened before. Now, with the USMCA concluded, not ratified but concluded, the question is, will the new foreign minister have ongoing responsibility for Canada-U.S. trade? I think it needs to be watched, and we will get an indication on the 20th of November when the new cabinet is appointed. The other thing I want to discuss, and maybe we'll do it, Jim, during the exchange, is assuming the USMCA does get approved, what does it mean for ongoing trade disputes? And related to that, and very much on Canada's agenda, is the future of the World Trade Organization. There have been major difficulties. There are major difficulties facing that organization. The U.S. in particular has major concerns about the dispute settlement system. How that evolves will have a bearing on the bilateral relationship. We can get into some of that in the discussion. But we can't ignore the multilateral side, and particularly the WTO, when we talk about Canada-U.S. relations. And we can then go on and talk about Canada, China, U.S., China, and all those sorts of things. But those are my brief opening comments.
Well, why don't you talk among yourselves right now on what you've heard react? I mean, I got plenty of questions, but I want you guys to react to what you've just said.
I just wanted to, the one thing probably doesn't surprise you that piqued my interest is this issue of whether it's a career foreign service officer or a political appointee who's the ambassador in either country. And I will say there was a time before I was an ambassador when I would have thought, why is it that the President of the United States would pick somebody like me to go to a foreign country? Why wouldn't he pick somebody like several of the people in this room who are experts in foreign policy and all of that? And well, and the answer, but there is an answer to it. And the answer is kind of just what Larry said, that I had a conversation with with the Prime Minister, where he once said to me, this was the prior Prime Minister, he said, look, I can pick up the phone and call the leader of any country in the world and get through whenever I want, except the United States. And it's, it's not that I can't talk to him, but, as Larry said, he's worried about the whole world. And so I deal with me a lot more than I deal with other ambassadors, because and the reason that I can deal with you is because I have the understanding that if I tell you something that's really important, it will get back to the right people. That is not to say that a career Foreign Service officer can't do that or wouldn't do that, but I just had the advantage. I knew the president. I knew the National Security Advisor. I knew the Chief of Staff. I knew the Secretary of State, and I had worked with all these people beforehand. I really came away with a different understanding of why this happened, and that is not in any way to demean career Foreign Service officers. Indeed, I couldn't have done anything I did without the career Foreign Service officers, several of whom are in this room, who taught me everything I knew about what I was supposed to do. But I knew how to do one thing that probably they didn't know how to do, which was to pick up the phone and call the president.
Well, and an example of that, I was working on the Gordie Howe, now called Gordie Howe Bridge, a bridge between Detroit and Windsor, the most important infrastructure project in the northern part of the United States, trying to get into the head of the White House and U.S. DOT. And the way I did it was I called David Jacobson, who I knew had worked in the White House.
He was just totally desperate.
He had worked in the White House. As I said, he was in personnel in charge of selecting ambassadors. He'd been deputy finance chair for Barack Obama. They were from Chicago. He knew everybody. And you got it moving. David, do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
All right. He's even modest.
Wasn't easy, but no.
So-
But it helps.
And if I just add a point, when you look at the history of appointments of Canadian ambassadors, not always, but often, certainly in the last 10 years, when political appointments or people from the political level have been appointed, to some extent they've been geared to whoever was in the White House. For example, when Barack Obama was president, Gary Doer, a former NDP premier, was appointed ambassador. The NDP, for those Americans who may not follow all the nuances of Canadian politics, the NDP is a left-of-center party. Gary Doer came from that party, and I think it was an astute appointment because he could relate better to the Obama administration than, say, a former conservative politician. Now we have a different White House. So the question is, what sort of political person might get the nomination from the Prime Minister? And there's a lot of names that have been mentioned, and I'm not going to go into those, but it is an important appointment from the Canadian point of view. It will help to determine the tone. It's not the only issue, not the only factor, but it'll determine the tone of the ongoing relationship over the next number of years.
The other thing, too, is you could be a political appointee but have been a career public servant. And there's a lot of those that are selected by presidents.
Like him.
Well, yeah, but others. Walter Mondale went, when I was in Canada, he went to Japan, for example. I mean, we were called, quote, political, but we'd spent most of our life in public service. And David, you had been in a lot of service in terms of helping Barack Obama and the community. But Selma, you wanted to chime in.
Well, I just want to chime in, first of all, on your point. I think you're absolutely right in terms of Washington. But again, because it's I'll call it a mixed audience, Canadian-U.S., and we have many many ambassadors who are sent to significant posts in the world who are career civil servants and career diplomats.
As do we.
And so it's really a function of the importance of the Canada-U.S. relationship, and I'll say the nature and the importance of it. And I wanted to comment on your comments about the WTO, because Canada has always succeeded in a multilateral environment, and what we have seen from the current U.S. administration, not to say that others haven't similarly acted, but this one is particularly strong in that regard, is they're more focused on bilateral relationships. What the U.S. didn't like about the NAFTA was the dispute settlement provisions in the NAFTA, right? No big surprise. What's the bone that's being picked? It's the WTO dispute settlement provisions. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to see a lot of resolution. And we're seeing, or we have seen recently, treaties that Canada has fought hard to bring forward. The Paris Accord would be one, where the U.S. is increasingly backing away. And so what does that do to our relationship? It goes, in my mind, to the importance of who the ambassador is, and that the current administration, or our new administration, or our new government, is going to have to invest more resources into our relationship with our single most important trading partner. When you start looking at the trade stats, there's still more trade between Canada and the United States than almost anywhere else in the world. It's one of the largest trading blocks. And I would say that the Trudeau government has not invested a huge amount in that relationship. Pulling Chrystia Freeland out of her role to negotiate the USMCA, I think, was probably a brilliant move, but a very tough one. And it also took her away from, maintaining her profile in other fora. So I think we're in for a very interesting time. I think it's going to be a very rough time for Canada-U.S.
Can I just say one thing about the Chrystia Freeland and her role in negotiating NAFTA? And this is more generic and not specifically about that. But one of the things that folks who are not involved in these things sometimes don't keep in mind is that these are people who are conducting these negotiations. And their interpersonal skills, their personalities, are really important to the process.
Yes.
And I think, and this is not to comment on anybody there, but oftentimes, and this came up on a number of occasions when I was the ambassador, and sometimes it was somebody in our administration, and sometimes it was somebody on the Canadian side, but it just wasn't working. Yeah. And so you figure out somebody who is going to make it work. And again, it's just you can never fail to take into account the importance of people in this process. As somebody always says here, personnel is policy.
I have several questions. I want you guys to deal with them. What was the impact of Obama's endorsement of Justin Trudeau? Secondly, didn't the two of you who are Canadian, didn't it anger you when the president said steel from Canada is a national security threat to the United States? What did you think about that? Let's hear some answers.
Well, I think Nick Nanos is the one who could best address the impact of Obama's endorsement, because he was watching the polls not only every day, but every minute. And he could tell us whether that had an impact. I think it had a moderate, but not an overwhelming impact. But, I'm not a pollster.
Positive, moderate, or negative?
No, I think it was a positive moderate, because I think President Obama has there's a positive view of President Obama in Canada that does resonate.
I think you're being too conservative, because when Obama won, lots of Canadians would have been quite happy to be the 51st state, if you will, because everyone loved Obama. And when Justin won, all of the Americans were thrilled, and they would have loved to have had Justin as their president. So I think that there is a correlation. My bigger concern is, what damage has that done to the Trump-Trudeau relationship by virtue of Obama stepping in? And Obama has at a number of very important events in particularly funerals, sadly, and you'd be much better at rhyming them off, who's passed, where he's given these incredibly moving and statesman-like speeches, which, have certainly resonated in Canada, and people have thought very highly of that. So I think Obama thought he was doing Justin a favor, and you and I chatted that, if you had some Liberals who were perhaps sitting on the fence and thinking, well, shall I vote NDP or shall I vote Liberal, that may well have pushed them over. There's an international law question. What is an former American president doing, commenting on Canadian domestic politics, our UN Charter? It's one of those seminal points that you learn in International Law 101. Stay out of somebody's domestic, politics and business. Anyways.
Okay, Selma, I agree. It didn't hurt.
Can I say in that I don't know how, and again, Nick could tell us a little bit more about whether it did or it didn't. My general experience in politics is endorsements don't make a whole heck of a lot of difference. People make up their own minds, and the fact that somebody else likes a candidate doesn't usually have an enormous impact. But I think, and this is Selma's point, and I think this is a fair one, I love Barack Obama, okay? I worked for Barack Obama for several years. I've known him from his days back in Chicago. I'm still involved in things with the Obama Foundation. I think this is a dangerous concept. What happens if Donald Trump starts endorsing candidates around the world, or Donald Trump's successor? This isn't a political thing.
Yeah.
And I'm just was a little bit uncomfortable with it for the precedent that it sets, and the potential that it could really backfire. And President Obama, just to analogize, has not taken any position in the Democratic presidential primaries for exactly that reason. That might help somebody a little bit, but it might hurt in the long run. And he didn't ask me, and he wouldn't ask me, but if he did ask me, I would have cautioned him about it.
Yeah, agreed. Nick, what say you? The horse is here.
The expert.
There's a problem of having too many stats at your disposal. So here's another interesting fact. Here's another interesting fact about the last election. As you know, the voter turnout generally in the election was lower, except in Liberal ridings that were too close to call. Actually, the voter turnout in Liberal ridings that were too close to call that they won was actually equivalent to 2015. We didn't see a material impact in the ballot support, but I expect that it had an impact in the motivation of some Liberal voters to come out and vote.
What was your other? There was another
Steel
issue.
tariffs. Didn't it boil your blood?
Yeah, it did.
That the White House would say that steel from Canada and aluminum from Canada, i.e. the head of the United Steelworkers is a Canadian, is a threat to the national security of the United States?
Didn't
that boil your
Jim,
blood?
It was.
Not to lead or anything.
It was a major issue, and in fact, it is still an issue because the resolution of those 232 tariffs was done through an exchange of letters. It is not a legally binding agreement. It is an exchange of letters, and so it has a legal status that at most is uncertain. Probably it is only a value as a political exchange, but the specter is still there of the possibility of Section 232 being used. And the USMCA, if it enters into force, and indeed the NAFTA, doesn't do anything in any way to restrict the ability of countries to use the national security off-ramp. Now, there's a question about what ingredients are required before it can be used. That's a whole set of other issues that are being litigated in the WTO, but it is an overhanging issue. I think we've resolved it, and hopefully it won't come back again, but the status of that exchange of letters leaves open the possibility that one of the letters can be revoked at any time. It was a major issue in Canada.
Jim, I'll just say I believe it was the only op-ed that I have written in a Canadian paper since I left. I wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail when that happened, kind of being outraged by it, and talking about how Canada had stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Peter referred to Normandy in Afghanistan, where I saw it firsthand, and I was just as outraged as Canadians by it.
I don't have a lot to add. I'd say Canadians were apoplectic. You know, it's hard to think of steel as a security issue. I think, you know, as someone who's looked at international law, to what you've alluded to, it begs the whole question of what is a national security threat. And I mean, we have that under our foreign investment. I don't think anyone would suggest that, you know, U.S. steel was a national security threat to Canada and there couldn't be U.S. investment in the Canadian steel industry because the Americans were a national security threat. So I think it fundamentally undermines the quality of the relationship. On the other hand, I'd say Canadians have or are becoming accustomed to the current president's non sequiturs and his tweets, and they take it with a grain of salt and sort of say, you know, look at all the other things he said, so,
Yeah.
you know, that Canadian shrug. But I mean, from a legal perspective, Larry's right there. It's unacceptable.
That brings up another set of issues. And maybe, Jim, if we can talk about ongoing disputes between Canada and the United States and the current impasse in the WTO. You know, it is almost certain that the WTO appellate body, for those of you who follow these things, will come to an end at the end of this year because the U.S. has refused to agree to nominating new members of the appellate body at the WTO. And that basically means the WTO dispute settlement system is frozen. It becomes, in a way, moribund because without an appellate body, the whole process is stopped dead end. Now, what that means for Canada-U.S. relations is interesting because Canada and the United States have taken each other to the WTO to resolve disputes on a frequent basis, and many of those disputes get resolved before they go to full-blown panels. But if the process of dispute resolution in the WTO is frozen, that means that a lot of disputes will be handled through the USMCA or through the NAFTA on a bilateral basis. And so my prediction is that if the USMCA gets through or if it doesn't get through, given the very intransigent position the U.S. is taking at the WTO, we're likely to see many disputes being handled through the bilateral dispute settlement process. And so we may be entering an era where instead of these matters being resolved in Geneva, they'll have to be resolved very close to home. And that is a factor that has to be borne in when we look at the future evolution of the Canada-U.S. relationship.
All right, I have two quick questions. First is, do you think that there's a strong likelihood that Peter MacKay, within the next year, will be the leader of the Conservative Party? My second question is, don't you think that Justin Trudeau is going to have to hire a lot of experienced people in dealing with negotiation and legislators who can respect members of Parliament of other parties to help him out? Don't you think he needs a more seasoned group of veterans to deal with Parliament?
Well, you know, I'm not dealing, hopefully, with political issues in this panel discussion too much, but there are lots of people that can be brought in. I think other panelists have mentioned that as a possibility, and you'll have to do that to deal with the problems that he has in terms of the Liberals being shut out in the three prairie provinces. You know, he'll have to rely on experienced people to help guide him through what will be a tricky process in Parliament. And as many of you probably know, with a minority government, day to day, every bit of political energy is consumed in trying to manage the House of Commons, there will be, my prediction is there will be very little, notwithstanding what the previous panel has said, very little ambitious or forward-looking programs, because all of the political energy in Ottawa will be directed to ensuring that the day-to-day management of the House of Commons is properly handled. That will be all-consuming.
Alex made some very good comments, though, in his, I think it was Alex, if I'm misquoting, please correct me, that there have been some tremendous initiatives, including, same-sex marriage, that have gone through a minority government. And so I think the question for the Trudeau government is where is there room to compromise, to build bridges, and to move forward? And if I were Justin Trudeau, the first thing I might do is have all of my MPs go through one of these courses. I know this sounds very academic, about how to negotiate and how to deal with difficult people and how to park your pride, park your party allegiances. Some people are far better at it than others. And I'll just give a shout out to Peter, who I think does a great job at parking his allegiances some of the time.
Where is
Particularly,
Peter hiding?
he's hiding back there.
It's back in the closet.
He's right behind
He's
Jim.
retreated to the
right?
back of the room.
But I think that that's a big issue in terms of moving the yardstick forward is, and to your point, do we have the right people in the House of Commons, or can you train them as legislators in order to succeed? And I think that's something as a leader he has definitely got to think about. But we will, the government will be challenged by the fact that many of the committees can hold them up to ransom, and which is to my point of he needs to work on, or they all need to work on, I think Andrew Scheer as well, because they have an agenda that they want to put through, and so does, Singh, that they need to understand how to craft a win-win solution where both parties or three parties walk away claiming victory. And that's how you move the yardstick forward. And that's not easy to do.
I'll just say, if those classes work, maybe we can import them down here.
Well, I've certainly in business, to your the earlier comment about how important relationships are, when you're negotiating a big deal and you realize that, your two lead negotiators are not getting along, what do you do as a CEO is you change the players, right? You try not to demoralize the person who you need to park, who may be absolutely right, but may not be able to build that bridge or strike that relationship, and put someone else at the table and park that person behind as the subject matter expert or the sounding board, because at the end of the day, you want that deal to go ahead. And, politics, as many in this room would know far better than I do, a lot of it is about making that deal and saving face and achieving what you want to achieve, perhaps at some personal cost or party cost, but you still get the opportunity to, raise the flag and cry victory. And the business community is no different than that.
Jim, I'd mentioned earlier on that even without a trade agreement, God help us, but even without a trade agreement, Canada and the United States will continue to do business, and there will be exchanges and flows of goods and services and people, because we are so interconnected. We've been focusing all of our political energy on the NAFTA and the USMCA, renegotiating the NAFTA. But it's very interesting that there are hundreds of working arrangements between Canada and the United States that we never even hear about. There are hundreds, literally hundreds, of memoranda of understanding between states and provinces on a whole range of things, from highway signs to you name it. And that is a reflection of how intense and interconnected the relationship is. So, yes, we want the USMCA to be ratified, and we want to avoid the uncertainty of it not being approved. But there are a whole series of, if you like, informal or non-treaty arrangements between Canada and the United States that are in place and will continue.
It's true. I always say that on any given day, as we speak, dozens of U.S. agency officials, or even cabinet members, depending on the issue, are talking to their counterparts in Canada.
Absolutely.
And usually in a very cooperative partnership arrangement. And that goes on whether David Jacobson's there or Jim Blanchard or Donald Trump. It's true that the bad tone at the top, arrests some of that, but it goes on. Talk about the climate change in the Arctic. Russia's in there now in a big way. China's in there. Canada always looked north and thought the Arctic was theirs. Of course, the U.S. and Canada patrol that, but even there are sensitive issues in terms of mineral wealth, trade routes, military maneuvers. You want to talk about, we're going to have a conference on that on April 16th and 17th, but you want to talk about what's involved for the audience here?
I'll just say, if there is an issue upon which the United States and Canada ought to cooperate, and I think this is kind of the point you were talking about earlier, don't just focus on the problems, try and focus on some of the things that maybe you can do together. The Arctic would be one of them. We have a community of interest, and we should be working together. And I again, I think more broadly, the way there's clearly been a tension in the relationship, partly because of USMCA, partly because of steel and aluminum tariffs, partly because of just personalities. But the way to overcome that, in my mind, is to focus on the things you can do, the things where your interests do coincide, and work on those. And one of those is the Arctic.
I agree. The Arctic is a matter that is often not emphasized in Canada as much as it should be. One of the things I think that's important, and Peter MacKay, as a former defense minister, he wore many hats previously, including Minister of National Defense. And coming from Nova Scotia, I'm sure he will agree with what I'm about to say. I think Canada has to do much more on defense expenditures. And that, in my view, it's a personal view, means moving ahead and spending much more on re-equipping the Navy. The maritime assets that Canada has are out of date, and we do have a national shipbuilding strategy. It has to be energized. And with that, in my view, we need to do much more in building Arctic-capable vessels, because we are woefully short of those at the present time. And by the way, I think increased defense expenditures would go a long way in helping to smooth the relationship with the United States. Because like it or not, Canadians, we are not pulling our weight on defense expenditures, including expenditures for Arctic assets.
So I'll just chime in. With climate change, we may not need Arctic-capable vessels, sadly. However, I agree with what you said, and at the last CUSLI conference, and I don't recall who gave the presentation, but we had a riveting presentation from someone who showed us how Russia has been expanding its footprint in the Arctic and all across the polar ice cap. And it was quite scary when you looked at the strategic moves that they have been making. And in Canada, there is not, generally speaking, a peep about that. There's no consciousness within Canada of the potential threat. I mean, it's obvious that Canada and the United States need to cooperate in this very important area. But even more importantly, we actually need to get with the program and understand what the threat is. And that makes our discussion in April of next year all the more compelling, which will be in Cleveland, just to give it a plug. But also, I think generally we all need to look at that and the consequences of climate change. It's making it a lot easier. The North is far more accessible than it used to be.
I think we all need to be conscious of the fact that China, a non-Arctic country, has built an Arctic-capable icebreaker. That, to me, is a wake-up call, or should be a wake-up call to all of us concerned with these kinds of sovereignty issues.
I understand the Arctic issues, though. the issues were not discussed in the recent campaign. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So that's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Let's throw it open to questions from the audience. Dick Cunningham.
I've been listening to these two panels and to talking about the election and the factors that influence the election. One of the things that has been most striking to me is an absence from any of this discussion of what I see. I'm an international trade lawyer. I go around to pretty much all of the developed countries, transatlantic, Western democracies. In all of them, there is a substantial component of the electorate composed of people who regard themselves as left behind by globalization, left behind by technology change, left behind by immigration, left behind by perceived cultural change fostered by elites that they don't agree with. And I don't hear any of that here. And I ask you to comment on that and ask you two specific questions. One is, do you have pills in Canada that people take that immunize you from this? If so, we need to know about it. But secondly, and more seriously, how do you deal with the United States, where that is perhaps most pronounced in the body politic, in things like trying to play a role as a middle power to influence international trade or influence climate change issues and things like that? How do you accommodate that attitude on the part of the United States? And I would only close by saying, don't expect that entirely to go away if Donald Trump loses the election, because there's a substantial wing of the Democratic Party that feels the same pain. They may have some different solutions, but they feel that same pain as a motivation for policies.
Well, I don't want to get into U.S. politics in this. Suffice it to say that I agree with much of what you say. And the one thing that I do think is worth emphasizing here, these are not problems that Donald Trump caused. These are problems that are happening all over the world. The divide between rich and poor is growing in most places, not shrinking. And it's given rise to populist movements all over the place. And it's not going to go away with the next administration, whoever that might turn out to be. And, at some point, Donald Trump will no longer be president. 4 years, 8 years, whatever. Or I guess 1 year or 5 years. Not to get carried away, but it's a really serious issue. It's a serious issue in the United States. It's a serious issue in Canada, perhaps a little less so, but it's a serious issue there as well.
So, Dick, to your comment or your question about those left behind, part of both the NDP and the Liberal platform, and I can't confirm for the PC platform, was to change the tax structure, was to tax the rich, was to change the personal exemption to raise it, which I thought was, quite frankly, was incredibly low. It's now at 12,500, and they're proposing to bring it up to 15,000 by 2022 or something like that. So that's not a significant change. There was also a lot of talk about affordable housing. I live in Toronto. Toronto and Vancouver are the two most expensive cities to live in Canada. The Liberal government put in certain financial incentives for people to be able to buy homes. But I forget exactly what it was, but it was so low in Toronto you couldn't even rub two nickels together to buy a house. So part of the platform was, again, both supported by, certainly the initiated by the Liberals, but supported by the NDP to deal with affordable housing. So I think there's some recognition there. We don't have a pill, sorry. We'd sell it to you at a very high price if we had it. This would be a business opportunity. And I don't feel capable of commenting on the disparity in the United States. I would say, or what Canada's role should be. I guess lead by example. The world tries to lead by example. Many of the OECD countries lead by example. Our Scandinavian friends have a tremendous social welfare program in place. That's not been popular in the United States. It's somewhat popular in Canada. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think Canada should be telling the United States what to do with its social welfare programs or those left behind.
This is sort of the flip of should Barack Obama be making endorsements in Canadian elections. I just think, in particularly in the one international relationship I know the most about, Canada and the United States, that it is almost, I won't say it's always a mistake, there may be exceptions, but it is almost always a mistake for Canadians to be telling Americans what to do politically. It's just the political issues in the United States are so difficult now, and the country is so divided that my advice to Canada and every other country in the world is stay out of it, because you'll end up making an enemy on one side or another. I mean, you've seen this. It's going on now with respect to Israel and the Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is the problem that was worried about in the White House and at State and elsewhere about what was going on, President Trump's conversation with Ukraine. It's, you don't want to put a foreign country on one side or the other of these incredibly deep political divides that we have right now.
Jim? It's Jim Peterson, my co-chair of the Executive Committee of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, former Member of Parliament and Trade Minister.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, yeah.
Just on that very issue, Jim, when your question about Peter, I was with a large group of Liberals a few days ago, and we were discussing that very issue, and we all concluded that we were going to join the Conservative Party so that we could support Andrew Scheer. On the issue that Selma raised, followed by David, the issue, does a foreign leader interfere in the affairs of another country, the domestic affairs? She was quite adamant that they shouldn't, but let me take you back to the mid-95s, when there was a referendum on in Quebec, Canada, that would have created Canada's own Brexit. The polls showed us losing about 3 weeks before the referendum date that the yes side for getting out was going to win. Lo and behold, the American ambassador to Canada, Jim Blanchard, went to President Trump, and he brought him to the
Clinton.
Clinton. Thank you. And he brought President Clinton up to Canada to speak before the Parliament and the Canadians, and he made a wonderful speech about how pleased the United States was to live beside a strong and united Canada. We won that referendum by 51,000 votes, and we're still together. So thanks for interfering, Jimmy.
Well, but he didn't say, I urge people to vote no and this and that. It was, it was more nuanced. But thank God we had Bill Clinton at that time. Yes, he was very positive and helpful, without meddling.
Does that mean we should have Trump come to Canada again now and then talk in the Canadian Parliament
I think
about
Donald Trump could
that's
unite,
exactly
he could unite the Canadians, actually.
That is exactly the issue. Is it's great if you've got a president who is well respected, who's thoughtful, and that's or a prime minister of Canada, it doesn't matter, or the president of France. It's great if you think they're great. It's not so great if you don't think they're great. And I just think it's probably, and again, there are exceptions, and there may be exceptions, but as a general matter, you're really on thin ice when you do that.
People say that they were shocked that Trump wasn't a big issue in the recent campaign. Is that correct? And what's your comment?
I think you're right. It was not a big issue. somewhat oddly, the successful renegotiation of the NAFTA, the USMCA, was not raised as a major triumph by the Liberal Party. Trade issues were not front and center in the election. And that reflects comments that the first panel made that major themes, major issues, major initiatives and policies were really not front and center during the campaign, regrettably.
One last question. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. My name's Rachel. I'm not asking for a pill for this, but one of the things that was missing, what I noticed missing in the conversations in both panels is youth leadership and the next generation of leaders and what those trends may or may not be looking like for the relationships between our two countries. And just to call out particularly climate change and global actions around climate change, and how here in the U.S., even today, this afternoon, there's a youth movement that's standing in Nancy Pelosi's office, and they're trying to push different legislation forward that's going to help address climate change. And I know certain things are happening across our border to the north with youth movements. And there's been report after report in the last week about digital use on the rise with very young people and screen time and so forth. So I'm wondering, are you looking at the changes and the shifting tools and technologies that are being used not just to fight climate change, but in everyday lives, and including business and trade, and how that moving forward looks for our relationship in the future?
There are a lot of issues to unpack there. And I begin by saying, and I know more about emerging leaders in the United States than I do about emerging leaders in Canada, but I will say that one of the things over the last few years that has been particularly rewarding has been the fact that there is a whole new generation of people, some of whom are just involved in the political process, some of whom are running for office, and it's not just people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, but on the issue of guns, and to the extent that there is any chance of any kind of what is referred to as common sense gun legislation. I won't get into the nuance of it and into the politics of it, but if it happens, it is going to happen because school kids have made a big deal of this, starting with the Parkland kids. And so, every time I am with a group of young people, whether I speak to them, I hear from them, I meet with them, I am made optimistic about the future because they're better than we are.
This panel is supposed to be talking about the private sector reaction to the last election. Let me just talk a little bit about what's happening in business. As governments have been relatively slow in dealing with the climate change environmental issues, including in Canada, it's interesting to see how the business community has moved ahead. And if you look at corporate reports, you'll see a major emphasis on environmental policies as part of annual corporate reporting. Why? Because shareholders are demanding that companies take action. And just like corporate social responsibility on human rights and a range of other issues that corporations have to account to the market for, there is an increasing emphasis by the private sector on these, if I can call it, green type issues, not because of government regulation or laws, but because they see it in their self-interests. And so in some respects, the business community and the corporate sector are ahead of governments in dealing with these environmental issues. It's not the only answer. We need a broader framework to attack climate change, but there is action in the private sector, often not appreciated generally.
You want the last word, Selma?
Well, I was just going to build, if that's all right, I was just going to build on what Larry said. We do have the task force on climate change that Mark Carney started in 2015. That is translated into banks requiring certain commitments by the companies that borrow from them with respect to their environmental issues. Right. The Canadian Securities Administrators, they have issued direction and guidance with respect to environmental disclosure. And in that rubric, the focus has been on climate change. The Canadian Association of Professional or Chartered Accountants of Canada has come out with publications. For those that are Canadian, may be familiar with the publications they put out, 20 questions boards should ask about X, Y, Z, whether it's internal audit or whether it's about governance, and they put one out on climate change. So I think it's squarely on the Canadian radar screen. I think Larry's quite right that we have not seen regulation the same way, but there has been a tremendous amount of guidance from the business community. And we used to see the environmental report as being a separate report from the annual report. This is now, generally speaking, considered good practice to integrate it into your annual information form, your MD&A, etc. So I think we are moving forward. To your question as to where young people are, I can't say that I'm an expert. I think they're very aware. With social media, how can they not be aware? Which child do you not know that's not on their cell phone or their iPad or their computer? And you can't miss it. And it's good that they are, because that's what we're going to need to move the yardstick forward.
Jim, can I just add two things? One is there was I guess a letter that was signed by more than 100 members of the Business Roundtable, which are the biggest corporations in the United States, talking about their responsibility to constituent groups other than their shareholders. And this is a part of it. That's number one. And number two, this is not just about climate. Climate is, quite frankly, the easy thing now for big businesses to talk about. Everybody talks about it. But it has gotten into more controversial subjects. Again, one of the really timely ones is guns. And some companies that used to sell guns that no longer sell guns, some people who are not going to process payments to entities that sell guns, and it's happening in a variety of ways. So the business community, I think, is stepping up. There's a ways to go, but they're moving in the right direction.
I want to thank our panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you for the patience of the audience. I want to call up Jim Dickmeyer. As we call up Jim, again, I want to thank our CUSLI people, Steve Petrus, Ted Perrin, Jim Peterson, our CUSLI members. Thank you. And, of course, the Canada Institute, which did all the administrative, clerical, organizational work here. It's been a great venue. We have to do this again. Nick Nanos, thank you for making a special trip in here. And, Jim, thank you to you and Jane and Mariana for all your efforts. And you have an announcement to make, and I'm going to let you do that. And I thank you for your partnership.
Well, I first want to thank Jim Blanchard, because in many ways he was the kind of intellectual origin of this, working with Laura. I got to inherit it, but they had really moved a lot of the idea forward. Jim put a lot of his own personal time into it. In the connection with CUSLI, we brought a lot of talent here to the center, and so really, Jim Blanchard, those of you from Michigan know what a force he is. I've had the pleasure of working with him on other things. He is a force. Sometimes he can drive you crazy. Those from Michigan know that too. But thank you very much, Jim. You really have made this a very successful program. Now we invite you for the fun part of food and drink. You just exit this door and go into what we call our boardroom. And please have some fun and discuss only what you heard on the panel. This is an intellectual exercise.
Same.
All right.
Same.
Jim.
Thank you. No, really, it was hard fun.